and it's a great pleasure to present our work here in the seminar. All two other co-authors are here, and Jakob will actually present the second part of the presentation. So it's well known that club goods generate benefits for members that are unavailable to non-members. And creating environmental clubs is one prominent policy proposal that could address free rider problems in global environmental governance. Yet the existing literature often considers them, these intergovernmental environmental clubs, as a theoretical idea, one that still lacks empirical manifestation. But looking at existing IEAs, it's not clear that this is the case. And against this background, our key research question is, do existing international environmental agreements provide club goods for their members? So the most obvious case to create a club good is to use trade measures. Some IEAs do include trade provisions alongside environmental commitments. Such trade provisions in IEAs, if they create club goods, can provide exclusive benefits to the co-signatories. They can act as incentives to join and accept environmental obligations. However, currently no study involving a large number of cases has investigated whether trade provisions in IEAs do indeed provide club goods to their members. There are a few exceptions that address trade effects of a smaller sample of IEAs, but these in turn do not account for varying trade provisions. At the same time, the legal literature describes IEAs and distinguishes two broad categories of trade provisions. And in order to be able to account for them in our research, our data is coded along these two types of provisions. First of all, trade liberalizing provisions. They cover rules intended to encourage trade flows, for example, or typically for environmental goods. Secondly, trade restrictive provisions. And those are rules that seek to restrict certain imports or exports, for example, of hazardous, dangerous waste. Note that a single IEA can indeed include a combination of trade liberalizing and trade restrictive provisions. So we expect the following. We expect trade liberalizing provisions in IEAs to privilege parties and have a discriminatory effect against non-parties. That's because there's little interest among states in formalizing a trade liberalizing concession in a treaty and extend it to all states. So in light of this, our first hypothesis is the more trade liberalizing an IEA is, the more trade flows are likely to increase between two parties relative to trade flows between a party and a non-party. We also expect trade restrictive provisions to have a discriminatory effect against non-parties. In the context of IEAs, these rules typically apply to goods for which trade is deemed harmful to the environment. For example, endangered species, waste, or pollutants. IEAs might impose trade restriction measures for these types of goods and for trade in these goods, such as quotas. Non-parties to these IEAs are likely to face measures that are even more restrictive or even entail trade prohibitions for these kinds of goods. So while the implementation of IEAs with trade restrictive rules might decrease trade among parties, we expect trade restrictive IEAs with non-parties to decrease even more. In other words, the more trade restrictive, and this is our second hypothesis, the more trade restrictive an IEA is, the more trade flows are likely to increase between two parties relative to trade flows between a party and a non-party. So if trade provisions in IEAs do not affect trade flows, one can be doubtful about the effectiveness of these agreements. If they restrict trade flows across the board, we can wonder if they rather serve protectionist interests. But if they actually increase trade flows among members relative to non-members, then these IEAs can be conceptualized as de facto environmental clubs. And analyzing them can, we think, be enlightening for the design of environmental clubs also in the future. And over to you, Jakob.
Yes, thank you. So what we have to test these hypotheses is a novel data set on basically all IEAs that were concluded even earlier, but particularly in the after-war period from 1945 to 2015. And this comes down to more than 2,000 international environmental agreements. And also we have data on the character of the trade provisions within these IEAs and on the particular character of these trade provisions in the IEAs. And we see that of all those more than 2,000 IEAs, more than 60% have at least one trade provision. So we see that these are quite prevalent. And that is what you saw in the previous graph over time, the share of IEAs with trade provisions compared to the share of IEAs without trade provisions, which is quite constant over time. And we can also classify the different environmental agreements by subject area to get a bit of a feeling for the data that we use here. And you see in these graphs, again, the share of environmental agreements of a particular subject area that has trade provisions included in it. And we see that particularly on the left-hand side, agreements on fishery, which are more than 1/3 of all IEAs in the data, are particularly prone to have trade provisions included. Also, agreements on weapons with the environment very often have particularly trade provisions included. Biodiversity, that's the second one, related to species, and also agricultural agreements or related to agriculture contain trade provisions quite regularly. When we look at the different classes of development status of the parties to the IEAs, we see that both IEAs between developing and other developing countries and those between developed and other developed countries particularly often have trade provisions included, which is not so much the case for North-South agreements, but the difference is not too large. So we're not only picking up effects of this year. I will come to that in a moment. Here's the next slide, thanks. So on the character of these provisions, as Clara said, there's both more liberalizing provisions, trade liberalizing provisions, and more trade restrictive provisions. And out of these overall 48 different types of provisions, we created indices on the trade liberalizing character of the IEA and the trade restrictive character of the IEA. And we again can look at how this is divided by different subject areas of the environmental agreements. And we see on the left-hand side that fishery agreements are particularly often very liberalizing, trade liberalizing. And compared to that, on the right-hand side, IEAs on agriculture and biodiversity, for example, are very often rather trade restrictive. The fishery agreements, as they have so much trade-related provisions in them, they also have some restrictive provisions in them. Yes, thanks. The next slide. So how do we test our hypothesis now? We're using data from the UN Comtrade database on bilateral exports between countries, and that is basically all countries. So we have roughly 150 countries in a panel of more than 30 years. And we're principally applying a very classical gravity equation or gravity estimation in the panel. So we're regressing the level of exports in logs on whether countries are in an IEA between each other, are both party to an IEA with each other, and how restrictive and or liberalizing these IEAs between them are. You see the equation below, and our variable of interest is the beta before the trade index, the particular one. So how much would a particularly liberalizing or trade restrictive IEA affect trade flows between the two parties to it? We're including fixed effects on the exporter-importer. So this is also diet observations, right? This is two countries, so one country pair, exporter and importer. And we're using fixed effects on the exporter-importer level to capture general selection effects into IEAs or particular types of IEAs that some countries might trade more with each other and therefore also include more trade provisions with each other. This is captured by that. And then also country time specific effects, so exporter and importer year effects, which captures, for example, changes in the GDP, etc. Next slide, please. So this is our results at the table, our baseline results. And we see first in the third row that generally, and this is in line with previous findings on smaller sets of environmental agreements, there is a negative effect on trade or on exports of entering a common environmental agreement with each other. But we also see, and this is the first row, that including trade liberalizing provisions in these agreements counters the negative effect and can actually turn it into a positive effect. I think you can go on a bit, Clara. Yes, I already had that. And we don't see that effect, on the other hand, for the trade restrictive provisions. So restricting trade with particularly outside countries doesn't seem to be so effective in producing that club. If you go to the next slide, Clara, you can see the combined estimated effect of including trade liberalizing provisions now in an IEA. So this is the overall effect on trade in percent that we estimate that entering into an environmental agreement of a particular character brings for the two countries. And we see that if there are no liberalizing trade provisions included, the IEA has a negative effect, but that at some point of the liberalizing index that we created turns positive, and for very trade liberalizing provisions, we estimate a positive effect on overall trade flows between the two participating countries. Next slide. So our paper shows evidence that actually some IEAs of a particular character do actually create de facto environmental clubs by raising trade flows between those, between the participating countries. And that is particularly those that include trade liberalizing provisions. What are the policy implications that we take from that? Well, first of all, it depends on the design of the IEAs, what effects it has in the end, and that may align it more with interests of the different stakeholders and the policymakers included. And particularly the trade liberalizing trade provisions are an instrument that could be used much more widely, as we see only 17% of all our IEAs in the data set include more than one trade liberalizing trade provision. So there's much room for the creation of environmental clubs more. What would be interesting avenues for future research in our view? Well, one would be, first of all, how does this affect outsiders or the interests of outsiders of these environmental agreements? Does it create incentives to join environmental agreements for countries that have not so far? And also, what are the effects within these groups? So the more club character a particular environmental agreement has, does it affect compliance with a particular agreement, for example? That's pretty much it. I think we're in time. Thank you. Looking forward to your comments.